On the sunny afternoon of June 28, 2022, at Dallas-Fort Worth International Airport, passengers on Flight 105 to Los Angeles were preparing for what they assumed would be an uneventful journey. However, the flight quickly turned into a scene straight out of a comedy sketch when an unidentified woman caused such a commotion that the aircraft had to abort its taxi and return to the terminal. What began as a seemingly minor dispute escalated into a full-blown spectacle involving police officers, bewildered passengers, and a woman who was determined to make her mark, one erratic claim at a time. As the officers navigated the narrow, crowded aisle toward the back of the plane, the tension in the cabin was palpable. The woman at the center of the disturbance appeared completely disoriented, her gaze unfocused as if she had just been jarred awake from a long, disorienting slumber, not from the comfort of a passenger seat, but perhaps from a forgotten corner of the cargo hold. Her eyes flicked wildly across the rows of onlookers, her bewilderment mirrored in the faces of fellow passengers, who watched the scene unfold with a blend of confusion, disbelief, and quiet curiosity. They exchanged uncertain glances, unsure whether they were witnessing an emergency, a performance, or a bizarre misunderstanding. When the officers finally reached her, their presence seemed to snap her back into reality. But the shock was quickly replaced by defiance. She fixed them with a hard, unblinking stare, her posture straightening, as if bracing herself for some injustice about to be inflicted. "Why am I being asked to leave?" she demanded, her voice thick with indignation. The words tumbled out as though she were the wronged party in some larger, incomprehensible drama, her tone an accusation, as though she had been caught in a conspiracy against her. Her hands gripped the flimsy tray table in front of her so tightly that her knuckles turned white, a physical manifestation of her determination to stay in place. The table, small and seemingly insignificant, became her anchor in the surreal chaos of the moment. It was as if, in her mind, that little piece of plastic held the key to her stability, her last tether to reality, preventing her from being swept away by the absurdity of the situation. Her body language suggested that without the tray table, she might be swallowed by the whirlwind of confusion, unable to make sense of what was happening to her. It was clear that, in her frantic grip, the table became more than just an object. It was her last defense against the unraveling of her perception of the world around her. Her grievance was far from the typical annoyances passengers might encounter during air travel, things like cramped seats, delayed flights, or the dreaded lost luggage that always seems to reappear just as you've given up hope. No, this was something altogether more primal, more urgent, something that seemed to tap directly into the most basic, visceral instincts of human survival, an alleged water shortage. The woman's thirst, rather than being a simple inconvenience, became the focal point of her entire outburst, morphing into an emotional spectacle of desperation that seemed almost theatrical in nature. Her need for water was not just a casual request. It was a desperate, unrelenting demand, one that crescendoed in urgency with each passing second. With all the dramatic flair of someone stranded on a remote desert island, she cried out as though she were on the brink of dehydration. "Water! I need water!" she shouted, her voice piercing the cabin with the fervor of a desperate soul stranded in the middle of the Mojave Desert. It was as if, in that moment, she had become a character in a survival movie, and the stakes had never been higher. But her plight wasn't just about thirst in the conventional sense. It was as though she was being deprived of the most fundamental human need, a basic right that, in her mind, should have been guaranteed. The intensity of her plea grew exponentially, amplifying with each breath, her desperation becoming palpable. It was no longer about a simple drink, it was a cry for survival. Every word seemed charged with the urgency of someone fighting against an unseen enemy, as if the absence of water was not just inconvenient, but a matter of life and death. Her claims of being dangerously parched quickly evolved into the focal point of her entire argument, completely overshadowing all other aspects of the situation. What could have been a straightforward dispute about flight procedures or airline policies became entirely eclipsed by her dramatic insistence that she was on the verge of dehydration. In her eyes, this alleged crisis of thirst took center stage, relegating everything else to the background. Her perceived mistreatment by the airline, the officer's calm and measured explanations, and even the airline's essential need to deboard the flight for safety reasons. Each of these concerns was drowned out by her relentless cries for water, turning her grievances into an almost theatrical performance. As the minutes stretched on, it became increasingly clear that the plane had transformed from a mere mode of transport into an unwitting stage for her personal drama. With each passing moment, her desperation for water became more exaggerated, and her antics grew more theatrical. Her raised voice, her wild hand gestures, her claims of unfair treatment, and her refusal to listen to reason all merged into an out-of-control performance. The officers, no matter how many times they tried to reason with her, offer reassurances, or explain the airline's rights, were rendered ineffective by her overpowering cries for hydration. Their calm and logical responses seemed utterly inadequate in the face of her unwavering obsession with the lack of water, which she treated as a life-or-death matter. The passengers, once passengers simply awaiting takeoff, now found themselves spectators of an absurdly dramatic display, unsure whether to laugh or cringe at the spectacle unfolding before them. The flight had become her stage, and she, quite clearly, had cast herself in the leading role. Her thirst, real or imagined, was no longer just a personal inconvenience. It had transformed into the focal point of the flight's entire narrative. While everyone else on the plane was simply trying to get on with their journey, her demands for water consumed the air, leaving the entire flight in a state of confusion, disbelief, and, perhaps, mild amusement. The situation, which could have been resolved with a simple acknowledgement of the airline's rules, had instead evolved into an epic battle for hydration, ensuring that her need for water would be the dominant, and utterly unforgettable, story of the flight. Despite her theatrical and increasingly desperate pleas, she steadfastly insisted that she had no clue why she was being asked to deboard. "No one told me anything," she exclaimed repeatedly, her voice rising with indignation, as if she believed the airline had launched a covert conspiracy against her basic human need for hydration. To her, the lack of water was not merely an inconvenience. It was a deeply personal violation, one that she seemed to believe was at the heart of her expulsion from the plane. The officers, trying to maintain composure and resolve the situation with professionalism, offered calm reassurances, explaining the situation once more in an effort to guide her towards the exit. But their words barely registered with her, lost in the whirlwind of her impassioned monologue. She shifted from pleading for water to framing her removal as an unjust exile from the friendly skies, as if she were being cast out of some noble sanctuary for daring to question the airline's decisions. It became clear that she wasn't just fighting to stay on the plane. She was embroiled in a battle for her perceived rights, convinced that her request for something as simple as a drink of water had morphed into a larger moral issue. The officers, standing firm in the face of escalating frustration, seemed to channel the weary patience of a high school teacher caught in a perpetual struggle with a particularly unruly student. Each word they uttered, laden with professional restraint, felt like an attempt to navigate the delicate balance between diplomacy and authority. One officer, his voice a mixture of exasperation and forced calm, delivered what was meant to be a simple explanation: "They don't need a reason to ask you to leave. They're a private company, and they have the right to refuse service." This statement, though straightforward, was, in fact, a glimpse into the often overlooked realities of corporate power, a lesson in business law that most people don't encounter until it hits them in an uncomfortable situation. In any other context, the officer's words might have been enlightening, a sharp reminder of how private entities operate within their legal boundaries. But in the heated moment, with tensions running high and emotions boiling over, this nugget of corporate law only seemed to add fuel to the fire. For the woman at the center of the drama, whose sense of injustice was growing by the second, it was as if the concept of private company rights was a direct affront to her personal dignity, an indignity she was unwilling to accept. Her reaction was nothing short of theatrical, as if she had just received the shocking news of an alien invasion rather than a simple explanation of a business policy. Her eyes widened in exaggerated disbelief, and her voice climbed an octave, turning from confusion to something more akin to indignation. It was as if she were convinced that the officers were playing some sort of cruel joke on her. With a mix of bafflement and growing frustration, she bombarded the officers with a rapid-fire series of incredulous questions, her tone carrying the weight of someone who felt she had just discovered the greatest injustice of her life. "So, you're telling me they can just throw me off?" Without a reason. Like, they don't even have to say why. She demanded, each word dripping with incredulity, as though she were trying to unravel some deeply flawed legal argument that had no place in the real world. Her delivery was an almost comical blend of disbelief and melodrama, as though she had somehow stepped onto the stage of a courtroom drama, where she was both the star and the victim. She was no longer just a passenger. She had transformed into a character in her own unfolding saga, convinced that the rules of common sense had been temporarily suspended just to single her out. The officers stood firm, their expressions a mixture of professionalism and quiet patience, repeating their explanation with a kind of unwavering resilience typically reserved for customer service representatives who field irate calls from frustrated customers. Their calm demeanor in the face of mounting tension revealed a quiet strength, one honed by years of handling difficult situations. Yet, no matter how carefully they articulated the rules and regulations, it was clear that their words were falling on deaf ears. The woman, however, could not fathom the concept that a private company had the right to exercise such sweeping authority. The idea that an airline could simply refuse her service, without explanation or justification, seemed to rattle the very foundation of her understanding of fairness and justice. It wasn't just a question of not getting her way. It felt like a direct challenge to her autonomy and dignity. Whether it was the shock of this newfound reality or an innate, stubborn refusal to accept defeat, this revelation ignited something within her. With each passing moment, her defiance grew stronger, transforming from disbelief into a fierce determination. She was no longer simply questioning the officer's authority. She was actively resisting it, digging in her heels, literally, and unwilling to back down. In this moment, the issue at hand had little to do with water or even the airline's decision. It became a battle of wills, and she was prepared to fight to the bitter end. That's when the situation transitioned from a minor inconvenience into something truly absurd, quickly escalating into a spectacle that could have easily been plucked from the wildest moments of prime-time reality television. The woman, stubbornly planted in her aisle seat as if it were her personal throne, launched into an increasingly erratic monologue that seemed to defy both logic and decorum. Each sentence felt like a disconnected whirlwind of confusion and self-invention, leaving the passengers around her not only puzzled but also oddly entertained. Is it because I'm white? Or maybe I'm black? Or because I'm tall? She demanded to know, as though her physical traits had suddenly become the subject of a mysterious conspiracy. With each rhetorical question, she spun her identity like a roulette wheel, unsure of where it would land but determined to make everyone else feel as disoriented as she did. Her tone fluctuated wildly between brash defiance and wide-eyed bewilderment, as though she were trying to audition for several conflicting roles in a drama she hadn't fully understood. At times, she sounded like a frustrated philosopher, other times a confused social commentator, and occasionally a stage diva desperate for attention. It was as if the turbulence inside the cabin had seeped into her mind, sending her on an unpredictable journey of self-reflection, or perhaps more accurately, self-exploration. Certainly. Here's an expanded and more detailed version of the paragraph. Adding to the already absurd scene, the woman's behavior took on a tone of dramatic flair that could rival any political campaign rally. With an exaggerated rise in volume, she suddenly declared her intentions for the highest office in the land. "I will be the first female U.S. president," she boldly proclaimed, her voice booming through the cramped cabin. As if to further emphasize the gravity of her statement, she threw her arms wide, as if embracing the very future she envisioned. However, this grand gesture, meant to inspire awe and perhaps support, seemed more fitting for a stage than a seat in an overbooked airplane. The narrow, claustrophobic confines of the cabin, filled with uncomfortable passengers and the looming presence of the flight attendants, didn't exactly provide the most ideal backdrop for such an ambitious declaration. In that moment, her aspiration to lead the free world seemed almost more comical than charismatic, as it clashed with the chaotic and disruptive scene she was causing, turning a potentially powerful moment into a bizarre spectacle. Meanwhile, the other passengers exchanged weary glances, their collective patience slowly fading away, much like the condensation on the cabin windows that was quickly evaporating in the stifling air. The once quiet hum of anticipation for the flight had turned into a tense, uncomfortable silence, punctuated only by the occasional muttered frustration. With resigned sighs, the passengers began to deboard, their movements sluggish and hesitant as they shuffled out one by one. They moved like reluctant extras in a chaotic, unplanned scene from a one-woman Broadway show, each step an unwilling contribution to the drama unfolding before them. Some glanced at their watches, others grumbled under their breath, but no one dared protest too loudly, knowing full well that no one could outdo the woman who had made this an ordeal. The flight crew, too, was feeling the weight of the moment. Their faces were masks of exasperation, a mixture of frustration and fatigue etched into every expression. They scrambled to maintain order, directing passengers off the plane while juggling their own internal desire for a break from the madness. Secretly, each of them longed for an intermission, a brief pause where they could collectively regroup, catch their breath, and perhaps even share a few choice words about the absurdity of the situation. But as the last passenger filed off the plane, it became clear that there would be no pause, no relief, only the continued unraveling of a flight that had gone completely off course. The scene was nothing short of chaotic, surreal, and strangely mesmerizing, a moment that captured the bizarre essence of modern air travel in all its theatrical glory. It was as if the very fabric of air travel had bent under the weight of this one outrageous incident, reaching a peak of absurdity that could only be described as a bizarre performance art piece. The passengers, with the quiet resignation of those who've seen it all, trudged off the plane in a collective, almost robotic manner, their faces marked by frustration and confusion. Meanwhile, the woman, the center of this unintended spectacle, stood her ground, utterly unfazed by the monumental disruption she had caused. Her defiant stance and her unwavering refusal to cooperate transformed her into an almost mythical figure, one who seemed unaware of the chaos she was orchestrating. It was as though she had unwittingly become the star of her own dark comedy, a performance that unfolded in real time, where every dramatic gesture, erratic outburst, and nonsensical claim added another layer to her absurd, high-altitude masterpiece. In a world where air travel is often reduced to a mundane, functional experience, this surreal moment reminded everyone watching that, sometimes, reality can be far stranger than anything scripted. The situation escalated quickly, transforming from a minor inconvenience into a full-blown spectacle. As the officers, clearly running out of patience and options, found themselves with no choice but to physically remove the disruptive passenger, the atmosphere aboard the aircraft grew increasingly tense. What followed could easily have been mistaken for a scene from a reality TV show, one where the drama is dialed up to its absolute peak. The woman's resistance was nothing short of theatrical, with her flailing arms and legs turning the narrow aisle into a chaotic stage. Her gasps, exaggerated, drawn out, and filled with an almost operatic flair, punctuated each moment of defiance, signaling her determination to hold her ground, no matter the cost. Amidst the physical struggle, she intermittently cried out in a voice thick with both indignation and despair, "I just wanted water." This line, simple yet laden with frustration, seemed to encapsulate her bewildering refusal to comply. It echoed not just through the cramped cabin but in the minds of the officers, whose patience had long since evaporated. In the days to come, it was a phrase that would likely replay in their minds, lingering like an earworm in the midst of their nightly rest, reminding them of the absurdity of the entire ordeal. The woman's desperate plea for water, though seemingly trivial, had somehow become the defining moment of her very public meltdown. As the officers struggled to restrain her, their hands grappling with both her resistance and the absurdity of the situation, one of them muttered something under his breath, likely a moment of quiet reflection, perhaps questioning every choice that had led him to this surreal moment. After all, how does one go from a typical day of airport security to physically wrestling a woman off a plane mid-flight? It's a scenario no officer would ever anticipate in their line of duty. As the altercation continued, a small crowd of curious passengers, peering through their windows and craning their necks, watched the chaos unfold with wide-eyed disbelief. To them, it must have seemed like something out of a low-budget action movie, where a seemingly normal flight had morphed into a full-blown, high-stakes drama before their very eyes. Passengers likely exchanged puzzled glances, unsure whether they were witnessing a minor disturbance or witnessing a bizarre, impromptu episode of reality television. Despite her defiance and the theatrical manner in which she continued to voice her complaints, the officers remained focused and determined. With professional restraint, they managed to finally escort her off the aircraft, though not without difficulty. She was handcuffed and escorted through the cabin like a prize contestant on a game show no one signed up for. Throughout the entire ordeal, she continued her dramatic monologue, proclaiming her innocence with fervor, as if the officers' indifference to her claims could somehow make her more believable. Her words, however, fell on deaf ears as the reality of her situation became unavoidable. The plane was delayed, the other passengers were inconvenienced, and she was now facing charges that would certainly put a damper on her future travel plans. In the end, the officers did what they had to do, though their exasperated expressions were a clear testament to the emotional toll the situation had taken. The way they carried out their duty, while professional, revealed an underlying weariness, one that was perhaps only matched by their unspoken desire for the quiet reprieve of routine office work. Their eyes, tired from the back and forth with an increasingly irrational passenger, spoke volumes. The chaotic scene, filled with heightened emotions and unpredictable turns, likely left them longing for the relative calm of filing paperwork and answering phone calls at a desk. It was a moment that highlighted not just the strain of managing such a tense situation, but also the unglamorous side of law enforcement, a job often filled with moments of tedium and bureaucracy, which, in that moment, seemed far more appealing than wrestling with a combative passenger at the airport terminal. Once the uproar finally died down and the disruptive passenger was firmly in custody, the officers took a moment to formally announce the charges she would face. The first charge, indecent exposure, came as a result of an unexpected and rather awkward moment during her removal from the aircraft. As she was escorted off, her dress, whether by pure accident or, perhaps, in an attempt at dramatic effect, slipped, exposing more than anyone on board or in the terminal was prepared for. This unintentional wardrobe malfunction became the first in a series of events that would escalate quickly. The second charge, disorderly conduct, was perhaps the most fitting for her behavior throughout the ordeal. The entire situation could have been described as a one-woman performance art piece, complete with shrill voices, exaggerated gestures, and an onslaught of off-the-wall comments. From the moment she refused to disembark, her actions had disrupted not only the cabin but the entire terminal, creating a chaotic atmosphere that left both passengers and staff reeling. It was clear that this charge wasn't just for one moment, but rather for the whirlwind of disarray she'd caused over the course of the altercation. Finally, there was resisting arrest, a charge that could almost be described as the grand finale of her dramatic performance. Despite multiple requests and commands from the officers, she refused to cooperate. Her resistance reached its peak when, in a final act of defiance, she threw herself to the ground in a theatrical display of protest. In that moment, it was as if she was auditioning for a role in a movie about a woman wronged by society, a role that, unfortunately for her, didn't align with the reality of the situation. The combination of these three charges, indecent exposure, disorderly conduct, and resisting arrest, created a legal trifecta that, like a well-orchestrated disaster, encapsulated the chaos and absurdity of the entire incident. Given her tendency to embroider every detail, one could only imagine how she would recount the events in her own version of the story, no doubt with her flair for the dramatic intact. Once in custody, the woman's erratic commentary took a bizarre turn, escalating to new heights of absurdity that could rival the most outlandish political speech or late-night infomercial. Her words tumbled out in a whirlwind of disconnected thoughts as she seamlessly blended political aspirations, global causes, and an obsessive focus on one thing: water. "I want to end burnout and win the Nobel Peace Prize," she declared passionately, her voice brimming with the kind of fervor you'd expect from a revolutionary leader rallying troops for a game-changing cause. Her tone was imbued with the kind of over-the-top enthusiasm typically reserved for motivational speakers, as though she were standing on a TED Talk stage, ready to unveil the next big idea to an eager audience. But there was no one to be swayed here, just a few disinterested officers who were likely struggling to suppress their confusion and impatience. As she spoke, Her words seemed to float in the air, unanchored to any reality, as though she was waiting for the officers to momentarily abandon their law enforcement duties, pause to listen intently, and perhaps offer a few encouraging nods. Maybe, in her mind, they were already planning to join her campaign to eliminate workplace burnout and rewrite the global order. In that moment, the woman seemed to believe she was not just any detained passenger but an undiscovered visionary whose ideas could change the world, if only she could get some water and a little recognition. Despite her grandiose aspirations and lofty declarations about world peace and political ambitions, the one constant that overshadowed all of her other concerns was an incessant, almost theatrical plea for water. "My mouth is so dry, it's hard to talk," she lamented, the desperation in her voice palpable, yet somehow oblivious to the irony of her never-ending monologue. The more she spoke, the more her words seemed to contradict her need for hydration. It was as though her physical discomfort was less about the lack of water and more about the opportunity to be heard. As she continued to vocalize her woes, it became evident that her dehydration had become the defining struggle of her existence in that moment. What could have been a simple request for a drink transformed into an epic narrative, one she spun with the dramatic flair of a reality TV contestant hoping for their 15 minutes of fame. Her appeals to everyone within earshot, passengers, officers, and even bystanders, turned a routine police interaction into a spectacle. The scene felt less like an ordinary arrest and more like a subplot in a farcical drama, where the stakes were oddly personal yet oddly trivial, the fight for a glass of water, in the midst of a moment that was rapidly spiraling out of control. Her statements vacillated wildly between the profound and the absurd, creating a strange and unsettling blend of delusion and fleeting clarity. One moment, she was deep in thought, waxing philosophical about the emotional exhaustion that had apparently consumed her, as if the weight of the world's burnout crisis rested on her shoulders. She spoke with the gravity of a self-proclaimed scholar, offering unsolicited commentary on how society was crippled by stress and fatigue, as if solving this global epidemic was somehow part of her destiny. Yet, in the very next breath, she shifted gears abruptly, comparing herself to iconic historical figures, suggesting that her arrest was merely the opening chapter of an epic story, one that would surely be written in the annals of history. It was as though she genuinely believed that, in that moment, she was on the verge of becoming the next great leader, destined to rise above adversity and save humanity from its own chaos. Whether this was the product of a warped sense of grandeur or a desperate attempt to delay the inevitable, her booking and processing at the police station remained unclear. What was indisputable, however, was her unyielding resolve to leave a mark, to be remembered, even if that legacy was forged with dry lips, a constant plea for water, and an ever-growing catalogue of incoherent and bizarre declarations. In her mind, perhaps, it didn't matter that her actions were nonsensical. What mattered was that she had, in some inexplicable way, captured the attention of everyone around her, ensuring that no one would forget the woman who demanded water and a place in history. At the station, the booking process began with an air of surreal absurdity, matching the bizarre energy that had followed the woman since her dramatic removal from the aircraft. Despite the stark change in setting, from a bustling airplane to a sterile police station, her behavior remained predictably erratic. As officers guided her through the standard booking procedures, which included answering a series of routine intake questions, it became increasingly clear that the woman's mind was singularly focused on one thing: water. Her obsession with hydration was nothing short of relentless. With the tenacity of a seasoned marathon runner pushing past their limits, she managed to request water no fewer than 47 times, an unyielding barrage of pleas, each more exaggerated than the last. At first, her tone was polite, almost charming, as though her request was just another simple inquiry. But as her thirst deepened, her exclamations grew more theatrical, bordering on the dramatic. She spoke of dehydration-induced suffering as though she were a character in a Greek tragedy, painting vivid pictures of parched throats and cracked lips. It became clear that, for her, the absence of water wasn't just a minor inconvenience, it was the central, defining crisis of the moment. In every word, every look, there was an unspoken promise that this battle for hydration would be her defining struggle, a thirst that could not be quenched by mere words or promises. The officers, seasoned professionals who had undoubtedly encountered their fair share of chaotic situations stood as the epitome of calm in the face of the passengers' increasingly bizarre behavior. Their faces remained impassive, betraying no sign of the internal exasperation they must have felt as they listened to her wild, disjointed ramblings. With the patience of seasoned caregivers, they tried to reason with her, calmly explaining that if she cooperated, the process would be much faster, and, most importantly, it would ensure that her much-needed glass of water would come sooner. They spoke with the kind of tact that only comes with years of experience, using simple logic to cut through her escalating irrationality. However, their words fell on deaf ears, as she seemed to retreat further into her own world, unwilling or unable to engage with their level-headedness. Instead of complying, she shifted gears into a new soliloquy that mixed personal ambition with a sense of world-altering urgency. Her speech veered wildly from one topic to another, as she mentioned her self-research theories on burnout with the seriousness of a published author, then segued into her lofty goals of achieving world peace. Her dreams of ending global suffering were on full display, albeit with a strange stipulation. None of her grand ideas could be put into action until her immediate request for hydration was fulfilled. It was as if the entire future of humanity rested on the delivery of a simple glass of water. As she spoke, her tone shifted from imploring to authoritative, as though she believed that, in the grand scheme of things, water was the key to solving all the world's problems, and without it, nothing could be done. The officers, maintaining an almost zen-like composure, seemed like calm anchors amidst the storm of chaos unfolding before them, yet the scene around them was unmistakably reminiscent of an absurdist play. The woman's emotional outbursts, ranging from pleading for water to claiming she would be the first female U.S. president, stood in stark contrast to the cold, methodical process of police booking. This strange juxtaposition, a fervent, disjointed narrative filled with irrationality and self-importance, set against the sterile, mechanical routine of law enforcement, created an almost dreamlike or surreal atmosphere, where reality seemed to bend under the weight of her increasingly bizarre behavior. As the officers continued their work, unfazed by the emotional tirade unfolding, their patience and professionalism took on an almost heroic quality. It was as if they were participating in an unscripted performance, where every moment was a test of endurance and diplomacy, requiring a level of restraint that only the most seasoned professionals could maintain. The woman's relentless quest for attention, fueled by a cocktail of confusion, defiance, and sheer stubbornness, became the centerpiece of what could only be described as a one-woman show of epic proportions. Despite the absurdity of her actions, the officers' calmness underscored the fine line between chaos and order, with each step they took, methodical, calculated, and dispassionate, highlighting not just their authority, but their remarkable capacity to deal with a situation that had the potential to spiral out of control. In the end, despite the chaos and unforeseen drama, the airline managed to resume its flight without any further interruptions, allowing the remaining passengers to finally continue their travels. However, for the woman at the center of the ordeal, the consequences of her actions were just beginning to unfold. As she was escorted off the plane by airport officers, her erratic behavior had already earned her a set of charges that would follow her long after the plane had taken off. She was now facing 3 newly minted misdemeanors: indecent exposure, disorderly conduct, and resisting arrest, each one a clear reflection of her disruptive actions throughout the entire incident. While her journey had undoubtedly taken an unexpected detour, it was her behavior that had truly left a lasting impact on everyone involved. The passengers, who had been forced to deboard the plane and endure her erratic outbursts, would likely remember the experience for years to come. It wasn't just the delay or inconvenience they had to endure, but the spectacle of a woman so determined to be heard, despite the chaos she caused. Her actions served as a stark reminder of how one person's outburst can ripple through an entire travel experience, leaving behind a trail of frustration and bewilderment for those unfortunate enough to be caught in the crossfire. Amidst the chaos of the disruptive passengers' antics, there were the unsung heroes, the other passengers on board. These individuals, who had been trapped in the confines of a plane, enduring the woman's emotional outbursts and erratic behavior, showed extraordinary resilience and patience. In the face of an unpredictable situation, where emotions were running high and tensions were palpable, These passengers exhibited an astonishing level of composure. They navigated through the inconvenience with an air of calm, following the crew's instructions without protest, and deboarding the plane with a quiet dignity. In a world where impatience and frustration often lead to chaos in stressful situations, the behavior of these passengers was nothing short of remarkable. Despite being delayed, inconvenienced, and caught in an awkward position, they embodied grace under pressure. Their response was a subtle yet powerful demonstration of collective heroism, a testament to their ability to remain courteous and understanding despite the ordeal they were enduring. Rather than fueling the tension or escalating the situation, they allowed the crew and authorities to handle the disruption efficiently. It is easy to overlook the importance of the passengers' actions when focusing on the outbursts of the disruptive woman. Yet, their calmness was the very thing that allowed the situation to be resolved with minimal disruption. They did not turn the scene into a public spectacle. Instead, they quietly went about their business, ensuring that the flight could continue, albeit delayed, and without further incident. In this unexpected moment of chaos, the real MVPs were not the officers or the flight crew, but the passengers whose ability to endure quietly and maintain their civility ultimately kept things from spiraling out of control. Their contribution, though often unacknowledged, was pivotal in restoring order, and their actions deserve recognition as they demonstrated the power of collective patience and grace in the face of adversity. In the end, this incident was not just a story about a passenger losing control, but also a profound lesson in patience, community spirit, and the ability to face adversity calmly. Although the woman in this situation had to deal with serious legal consequences, the other passengers on the flight showed us the power of patience and the importance of maintaining mutual respect in tense situations. This not only helped maintain order amidst the chaos, but also demonstrated that in difficult moments, unity and the spirit of overcoming challenges together are the most important factors. This story reminds us that in every stressful situation, patience and courtesy not only help us stay composed, but also ensure that the incident doesn't affect those around us too much. In fact, when facing chaos, what matters is not avoiding or running away from the problem, but how we handle the situation wisely, skillfully, and responsibly, thereby creating a peaceful and safe environment for everyone.